In the early 1940s, the world was at war. Nations burned, industries roared, and science became a weapon. But hidden beneath the chaos, something extraordinary was being built. Not just armies, not just empires, but the foundation of the modern world. Every chip, every computer, every phone, even the one in your hand right now, traces its origin to a battlefield. This is the story of how war created Apple. Before the Second World War, there was no Silicon Valley, no computers, no personal electronics, no digital revolution. Technology was slow, mechanical, and fragile. But when the war began, the race for survival became the race for innovation. In Britain, scientists worked day and night to perfect radar, the invisible eyes that could see aircraft before they struck. In America, research laboratories expanded under military funding, linking universities with the Defense Department for the first time. MIT, Harvard, Stanford. These were no longer just schools. They became engines of innovation, funded by war, driven by fear, and destined to change history. The United States created the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a vast network of scientists and engineers whose only purpose was to invent faster than the enemy could adapt. Under its umbrella, breakthroughs in computing, communication, and cryptography flourished. The first digital computers were not built for business or entertainment. They were built to break codes and calculate missile trajectories. In 1946, as the war's smoke cleared, engineers unveiled the ENIAC, the world's first fully electronic computer. It filled an entire room and consumed enough electricity to power a neighborhood. But it worked. And in that humming grid of circuits and vacuum tubes, humanity caught its first glimpse of the future. The Cold War that followed ensured that this future would not fade. As nations armed themselves with nuclear weapons, they needed machines capable of thought, computers that could predict, simulate, and calculate the unthinkable. So the money kept flowing. Military contracts turned engineers into pioneers. And California, warm, wide, and filled with land, became the laboratory of the atomic age. In 1951, Stanford University leased part of its land to high-tech defense companies. Soon, the valley around it became crowded with engineers working on radio, radar, and missile guidance systems. Among them was a small group experimenting with a strange new device, the transistor. It was tiny, fast, and unlike the vacuum tubes before it, it didn't burn out. It would soon replace the massive machines of the war with something that could fit on a desk. The transistor was born from research at Bell Labs, research paid for by military communications contracts. And that invention, that one spark of innovation, became the seed of the modern computer industry. From it came microchips. From microchips came circuits. And from circuits came the possibility of a personal computer. By the 1960s, the United States government was pouring billions into defense and space technology. NASA, the Pentagon, and the newly formed Advanced Research Projects Agency funded projects that would later be used by private companies. ARPA would eventually build something called ARPANET, a network designed to share data across multiple computers, so that military systems could survive even a nuclear attack. It was the first version of what we now call the Internet. The Cold War had become an incubator for innovation. The fear of destruction was fueling creation. Every radar upgrade, every missile program, every satellite launched into orbit pushed science closer to the digital frontier. When the 1970s arrived, the world was different. Microprocessors, developed for missile guidance and calculators, were now small enough to be placed in consumer products. A new generation of engineers, many children of wartime scientists, began experimenting with computers not for war, but for creativity. Among them were two young men in California, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They didn't work for the government. They worked in a garage. But every tool they used, every chip, every transistor, every circuit board, existed because of decades of military research. The same transistor that guided a missile would now power a personal computer. And the microchip once used in Cold War satellites would soon run the first Apple computer. When Jobs and Wozniak built the first Apple computer in 1976, they were standing on the shoulders of a generation of scientists funded by fear. The components they soldered together were descendants of war. Their ideas, however, were descendants of peace, of curiosity, of human expression, of rebellion against the machine's original purpose. The Apple computer was revolutionary not because it was born from technology, but because it was the first time that technology returned to the people. For decades, machines had been built to calculate destruction. Now they would calculate dreams. The digital age had begun, but its DNA was still military. Every network, every satellite, every chip carried the imprint of the war that made it possible. Even the touchscreen in a modern iPhone can trace its origin to defense research, developed in laboratories that once built guidance systems and cockpit displays. Global Positioning System, or GPS, was designed by the US military to guide missiles across the planet. Today, it guides millions of people home every night. It's a strange legacy that the same technology that was meant to destroy now connects us, entertains us, and defines us. But history rarely creates clean lines. The story of progress is always written in the language of conflict. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it marked the end of one war and the beginning of another kind. A war for innovation, for markets, for information. The companies that had once built machines for defense now built machines for communication. Intel, Microsoft, Apple, all born from the soil that war had fertilized. And so, every time a new iPhone is unveiled, every time a microchip grows smaller or faster, it's worth remembering where it came from. Not from peace, but from a race to avoid annihilation. Not from comfort, but from crisis. War had forced humanity to think faster, to build smaller, to push further, and out of that pressure came invention. The irony is almost poetic. The greatest tools of peace came from the machinery of war. The same world that built bombs also built the code that powers our lives. The same minds that invented radar invented the digital revolution. Today, Silicon Valley stands as a monument to that paradox. A place where innovation and profit have replaced tanks and planes, but where the spirit of competition still burns just as fiercely. In the factories of Shenzhen and the laboratories of Cupertino, the hum of production echoes the same rhythm that once filled wartime assembly lines. Speed, efficiency, precision, control. The language of industry never truly changed. Only its purpose did. So when you hold your phone, remember this. You're holding the descendant of radar, the child of the Cold War, the grandchild of the atomic age, a piece of the same history that once decided who would live and who would die now decides how you connect, how you learn, and how you see the world. War didn't just shape nations, it shaped technology, it shaped ambition, it shaped us. And though we may never escape its shadow, we can choose what we build with what it left behind. Because in the end, the story of Apple is not just the story of innovation, it's the story of transformation, of how the will to survive became the will to create, how the instruments of destruction became the tools of progress, and how one generation's fear built another generation's future. The war that created Apple did not end in 1945. It simply changed its battlefield. From the trenches to the laboratories, from the bombs to the circuits, from the roar of engines to the quiet hum of microchips. And in that hum, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the past. The sound of a world learning, once again, how to build something beautiful from the ashes of its own creation.